Good morning, everybody. Today we'll be discussing fractures and their healing. We'll be discussing the definition of fractures, the types of fractures, the nomenclature used to describe a fracture. Then we'll briefly discuss the healing of fractures and the management of fractures. And at the end, we will discuss certain types of maxillofacial fractures. So, by definition, a fracture is a break in the continuity of a bone, which is associated with variable degrees of damage to the overlying skin and soft tissues. So, a fracture may be described as a simple fracture or a compound fracture. A simple fracture is a closed fracture where the overlying skin and soft tissue is intact. It may be contused or bruised, but it is intact and the bone is not exposed. A compound fracture is where there is an existing overlying wound and the bone may be exposed to the environment and to the dust and dirt at the accident site or the trauma site. So, simple and compound fractures. Here you see on the left an example of a simple fracture. The bone inside has broken. However, there is bruising and contusion of the soft tissues. However, the overlying skin is intact. Another fracture of a example of a fracture of the ankle, but the overlying skin is intact. Here you see a compound fracture where the underlying bone is fractured, but the bone ends are exposed because of overlying wound and trauma to the soft tissues. Here you see another example of a compound fracture where the bone is lying outside the soft tissues. Simple fracture, swelling, bruising, deformity, and a compound fracture where the bone and the soft tissues lie exposed. Now, fractures can be described according to the shape of the fracture line. Fracture can be a transverse fracture or an oblique fracture or a spiral fracture, or it can be a comminuted fracture, meaning multiple bone pieces. More than two bone pieces means it's a comminuted fracture. And then you can have a segmental fracture where a large chunk of the bone or a segment of the bone is separated. Again, here the bone pieces are more than two, but a large bone piece is segmentally broken away from the other two main bones. This segment can be in the shape of a wedge also, then it is called a butterfly fragment. So, compound or simple fractures can all be transverse, oblique, spiral, comminuted, or segmental. If this is overlying skin and soft tissue is intact, this would be a simple transverse fracture. And if the overlying skin is broken and the soft tissue is damaged and the bone is exposed, then this would be a compound transverse fracture. Same for the oblique, spiral, comminuted, and segmental fractures. X-ray picture of transverse fractures. The fracture line is almost horizontal compared to the long axis of the bone. Here you again see almost this is a lower one third of the femur. This is tibia, upper third, and this is fibula. This is an example of oblique, and this is an example of a spiral fracture. So, all these fractures can be simple oblique or compound oblique fractures. Then these are examples, X-rays of comminuted fractures. Here you see multiple small bone pieces, and these are the main two pieces, upper third of the femur. This is the lower end of the femur, just above the knee, and there are multiple bone pieces. Another example of upper end of ulna fracture and humerus fracture. This is a transverse fracture of the humerus. There is a comminuted fracture of the elbow complex. The lower end of humerus is also fractured, and here you can see multiple bone pieces of the upper end of ulna. Comminuted fractures, upper end of tibia. This is fibular head, upper end of tibia. This is the radius, lower end of radius, and the lower end of ulna, again comminuted fractures, X-rays. Segmental fracture, as I said, there is a big bone piece above and a main bone piece below, and the middle segment, all being intact, is separated from both these two main pieces. So, in segmental fractures, there is an intact segment of the bone, but the total number of bone pieces is more than two. Here is another example of a segmental fracture of the tibia. You see this segmental fracture. Again, here a segmental fracture of the tibia. So this can be a simple segmental fracture or a compound segmental fracture of the middle third of the tibia. Then there are types of fractures depending on the cause of the fracture. The commonest fractures that we know are the traumatic fractures, where the strong force is applied to the bone and breaks it. However, there are types of fractures where there is a primary pathology in the bone which weakens the bone and causes it to break after a minor injury or just under the body weight. General causes of pathological fractures include senile osteoporosis. With aging, there are hormonal changes in the body because of which the bones become weak, and a minor trauma or a slip can break the bone. Examples would be fractures of the spine and fracture of the neck of femur in old age. Then there are endocrinal diseases like hyperparathyroidism and Cushing syndrome, which weaken the bone and alter the mineral to osteoid balance in the bone, and the bone can fracture after minor trauma. There are local causes which can make the bone susceptible to fracture. Local pathologies like inflammation or an infection, for example, osteomyelitis of the bone or infective tuberculosis of the bone. Then there can be bone tumors which can grow inside the bone and erode the bone cortex and make it very weak, and the bone can fracture. Similarly, benign bone cysts can slowly enlarge and erode the overlying cortical bone, making it thin and weak and susceptible to fractures. Then fibrous lesions like fibromas or fibrosarcomas can arise in the bone, and they erode the bone and make it susceptible to fractures. So these are examples of pathological fractures. Then there are special varieties. Green stick fracture, which is commonly seen in children. This is primarily secondary to a trauma, but like a green shoot of a or a green branch of a tree, if you try to break it, it may snap a little, but generally it bends, and it may not go back to its original shape, but it doesn't break into two pieces. The bones in children are more malleable and less brittle than in adults, so these bones are likely to have a bent fracture. These fractures where the bone is only bent and not broken up into two pieces are called green stick fractures. Then another variety is stress fracture of the bone. Stress fracture is due to minor trauma recurring hundreds and thousands of times, and this micro trauma then ultimately leads to uh, minor fractures in small bones, and this is commonly seen in athletes who train on hard surfaces like concrete, and also seen in young cadets in the military where they rehearse their drills on concrete floors. Here is an example of a pathological fracture. There is a bone cyst in this bone, which has, if you look at the cortex thickness here, it is very thick. But if you look at the cortex thickness here, bone cortex is very thin, and minor trauma can then lead to fracture. Uh, the primary process is not the injury itself or the trauma itself, but the primary pathology is the weakness in the bone. There is another example of a pathological fracture. You see radiolucence here and a subtrochanteric fracture of the femur, uh, secondary to a bone cyst. Here you see widening of the bone and a radiolucent area here. This can be a bone tumor or a bone cyst, and you see the thinning of the cortex and a fracture at this site, pathological fracture. Here you see an example of a green stick fracture, and this is a green stick which has been bent but has not completely broken up into two pieces. Uh, Here you see that this ulna is very much bent, and here you see this radius which is very much bent. Although one cortex has broken, but the continuity of the bone is still present. Stress fractures are usually become visible in the metatarsals or the lower tibia, as I said, in long distance runners who practice on hard surfaces or roads, or in military cadets who practice their drills on concrete floors. Small recurrent micro traumas lead to micro fractures. Here you see a healing stress fracture. There is callus formation around the fracture site that makes the fracture obvious. Here is another example of a stress fracture. These stress fractures, once the callus starts forming, they can be seen on X-rays. Otherwise, these stress fractures are usually identified in the early stage with radioisotope bone scanning, where you see concentration of the radioisotope at the fracture site. So, how does a fracture present clinically? Uh, it's obvious that the patient will have severe pain and tendernesses. When you touch the fracture site, it is very painful. Then you see swelling here and bruising. So, pain, tenderness, swelling, and bruising, uh, especially in subcutaneous bones, would be a giveaway sign of an underlying fracture. Then the next commonest thing you will encounter is a deformity, as you see here, deformity and loss of function. This arm can no longer function normally, this leg can no longer function normally. And then the next clinical sign would be a bone crepitus. If you gently try to press the two bone fragments, they rub against each other, and a bone crepitus can be palpated under the hand. Here you see the bruising after fracture of the underlying ribs. So, how do you diagnose a fracture? First, the history of a injury or trauma, or the history of an infective process involving the bone, or a history of a bone swelling, or which may be a tumor in the bone, or deformity of the bone in pathological fractures prior to the actual fracture. Then the clinical picture, as we discussed previously, the uh, pain, swelling, bruising, deformity, loss of function, and bone crepitus would give away that there is an underlying fracture. Then there are certain special investigations. Usually, fractures are diagnosed on X-rays, but in complicated bones like the pelvis or the cranium and head and neck, CT scan of the bones or the MRI can give away minor fractures. And as I said earlier, in case of stress fractures, um, radioisotope bone scan can also help. Here you see a bone cyst in the lower end of the radius. This would lead to a pathological fracture. This is, you see very deformed bones, although they appear to be osteosclerotic. Um, so this is brittle bones disease, where the bones are very brittle because of less osteoid and only mineral in these patients. This is a congenital anomaly, and these patients generally have multiple fractures over their lifetime after minor injuries. This is a subtrochanteric fracture of the femur. Another example of fracture neck of femur, the previous one we saw was a subtrochanteric. Subtrochanteric is below the lesser trochanter. Here you see the head of the femur, and this is the neck of the femur, and this is the greater trochanter, and this is the lesser trochanter. So this would be because most of the length of the neck is intact, and the bone has fractured just below the head of the femur. This would be a subcapital fracture, just below the cap or the head. Here you see a fracture of the pelvis. The head of the femur has been driven through the acetabulum, breaking the ilium away from the ischium, and here you see multiple fractures of the ischium and ischiopubic rami also. Here is an example of a fracture of the body of the vertebra, and this bone chip you see elevated away from the body of these one of the vertebrae in the spine. So what are the complications of fractures? These are divided into general complications and local complications. General complications include shock, which can be neurogenic shock or oligemic or hypovolemic shock. As we discussed in our previous lecture on shock, neurogenic shock is generally because of either shock to the sympathetic system in spine fractures, or it can be because of the severe pain that accompanies a fracture. Oligemic or hypovolemic shock we discussed previously in larger bones. For example, a patient with a simple fracture of the femur can bleed 1.5 liters into his thigh with only disclosing swelling of the thigh on the outside. Similarly, fractures of the pelvis can bleed intra-abdominally or retroperitoneally up to 3 liters overnight. So, the first and foremost in fractures of large size bones would be to relieve the pain and to replace volume. Initially, you can start off with crystalloids, but generally, uh, 2 to 3 units of whole blood or red cell concentrate may be required to simply compensate for the blood lost within the body inside the soft tissues before you actually go for definitive treatment. So this would be the first aid in case of fractures of large bones. Then in fractures of tibia and femur, fat embolism is a not a common complication, but these are the bones where fat embolism is the commonest seen compared to other bodies, other parts of the body. Fat embolism is generally not necessarily a piece of fat breaking from the bone marrow and going into a blood vessel, but it is a phenomena where the fat comes out of solution. As you know, cholesterol or fat is in solution in the body, but subsequent to trauma of a large bone, the fat can become insoluble in the form of globules, and it can then embolize to the pulmonary system. Then in fractures, as you know, the patient is immobilized for long time. The bones take long time to heal. For example, in the upper limb, the earliest a bone would unite would be 3 to 6 weeks, and in the lower limb it would be 3 to 6 months. So prolonged recumbency has its own complications because you're not using your muscles and your body. It would lead to osteoporosis of the bones, and generally there will be bone loss all over the body. Then you can have pulmonary or urinary tract infections because of recumbency or being immobilized. Urinary catheters may need to be passed, and because of fractures, the patient is not moving around, and parts of the lung can collapse, and especially in case of fractures of the ribs, and leading to consolidation and pneumonias. Then deep vein thrombosis, clotting of the blood in the deep veins of the legs, is another complication of prolonged immobilization. Another complication of prolonged immobilization in a fixed position, where the internal bone of the skeleton is pressing the skin and the soft tissues towards the hard mattress outside, or a hard bed outside, and the skin and the soft tissue gets continuously pressed and becomes ischemic, and then ultimately necrosis, leading to bed sores. Then joint stiffness, if you don't move your joints over a long period of time, if the joints are immobilized either in traction or plaster of Paris cast, then ultimately when after a few months, when the plaster cast is removed, the joints have become stiff, and takes a lot of effort and physiotherapy to restore the original function. And then psychosis, of course, because of polytrauma, multi-trauma, and prolonged immobilization, and the apprehension of the patient, whether the patient will be able to walk again or whether he will be able to use his hand again, and that sort of worries lead to depression and psychosis. An early bed sore in the sacral region, you can just see swelling and redness. Here is another pressure sore on the greater trochanter for prolonged lying on the side. Such uh, pressure sores are usually seen either with the fracture of the spine or the fracture of the pelvis and lower limbs, where the patient cannot change posture regularly. This is an advanced pressure sore where the overlying skin, this is the sacral region, so this skin and soft tissue was compressed between the sacral bone inside and the bed on the outside. And as you know, we all change our posture every few minutes. If the patient is unable to change posture, the overlying skin caught between the bone and the hard bed outside becomes ischemic and then necrosis, and these are difficult wounds to heal. So now we come to local complications. Local complications are vascular injury, nerve injury, or visceral injury. Vascular injury, of course, if a blood vessel is impinged on by the sharp end of a bone, it can traumatize, bruise, or even cut a blood vessel. Same with the nerves. When a bone is displaced, the nerves in the vicinity can be stretched, leading to neuropraxia, or the microscopic axons of the nerve can break. That would be axonotemesis, or there can be a break in the nerve itself, which would be neurotemesis. Uh, Visceral injuries, especially with fractures of the pelvis and fractures of the ribs, for example, a fractured rib can puncture a lung when it is pushed inside, and in fractures of the pelvis, it can rupture the urethra, rupture the urinary bladder or the rectum, and in case of ladies, the vagina or the uterus, um, leading to uh, injuries. When any of these local complications, vascular injury, nerve injury, or a visceral injury, is accompanied by a fracture, these fractures are called complicated fractures. Remember, there are simple and compound fractures. If their overlying skin is intact in this fracture, but it is complicated by a vascular or a nerve injury, this would be a simple transverse or oblique fracture of the lower end of the femur, which is complicated by a vascular or neural injury. So this would be a simple complicated fracture of the lower end of humerus. Vascular injury, nerve injury, visceral injury, when you have these in a fracture, then that fracture is called a complicated fracture because it is now complicated with local complications. Then local complication would be another local common complication would be infection in the bone, leading to osteomyelitis, or there can be wound infection because of in compound fractures. Osteomyelitis is because the blood supply in the bone is at the fractured ends is very limited. Uh, these infections are very difficult to treat. Then avascular necrosis of the fractured bone segment. In certain areas of the body, for example, in the head of the femur, in the scaphoid bone of the carpus, and in the talus bone of the foot, uh, the overlying structures pass over these areas, but there is no muscular attachment to these bones. As the muscle bellies give off a lot of blood vessels which penetrate the bone under the muscle, and therefore the blood supply of bones which have overlying muscles is much better. But in this case, as you know, the trochanteric anastomosis gives off end arteries which then go under the periosteum of the bone or through the medulla of the bone to reach the head of the femur. If the bones break here, the blood vessels also break, and very limited blood supply comes through this ligament of the head of femur. So this part of the bone is now deprived of blood supply, and it will go into avascular necrosis. Avascular is when there is no blood supply, and ultimately no body tissue can live or survive without its blood supply. Same happens to the proximal part of the proximal end of the scaphoid, and same can happen to the body of talus if the neck of the talus is broken. Then another local complication is myositis ossificans around joints. This is especially noticeable in case of elbow, but may also be seen around the hip. Here you see elbow, and there is extra bone deposition inside the muscle surrounding the elbow joint. That, of course, leads to limitation in the movement of this joint, because this can become very, very stiff. So myositis is inflammation of the muscle uh, that may be because of secondary to the trauma that actually broke the bone at the time of injury. And then this is ossificans, means bone deposits in this inflamed muscle. So this would lead to restriction of movement. Then there can be problems with the fracture healing or fracture union. These are malunion, delayed union, and non-union. Malunion is when there is angulation, shortening, or rotation of the bone still exists after the bones have united, the two ends of the bone have united. And this would then, of course, need a corrective osteotomy, or a wedge of the bone is removed and internal fixation. Then after aligning the bone pieces are fixed in internally by either through using intramedullary nails or overlying bone plates and screws. In case of delayed union, uh, the fracture is healing, but it is not healing at the speed that you would expect. Sometimes immobilizing the limb for a longer period, another few weeks, helps. Occasionally, you have to go in, operate, remove the excess callus and osteoid, clean the bone ends, and place soft tissue cancellous bone grafts there, which then bring the stem cells, bone stem cells to the area, and may heal the fracture. Then there is non-union, which may or may not have pseudoarthrosis. Non-union is when the bones have failed to unite and have stopped their effort to, the two ends have stopped the effort to unite. Or there may be a fibrous deposit. Fibroblasts have deposited fibrous tissue in between the two broken ends, which is preventing the callus from forming and the two ends to unite. In such a case, artificial false joint, pseudo is false joint may be formed at that site, because the fibrous tissue can bend under body weight or by applying force, and this would be a false joint in the middle of a forearm or in the middle of a humerus. Treatment, of course, then is internal fixation. You have to go in, remove all the excess unhealthy soft tissue, and clean the bone ends, put in bone grafts, and fix the bone in good position and good opposition, so that the healing can take place. Here you see malalignment. This bone POP cast on this fracture of the lower end of tibia did not correct the deformity of the fibula and tibia adequately. As you can see, the long axis of the upper segment is going in this direction, and the lower segment is going in this direction, and there's a big angle in between, usually more than 10 degrees angle, or a displacement of more than one third of the bone should not be accepted. However, this guy was lucky and the bone has healed. However, now this patient has this protruding bone here and excess bone deposition here. In a child, this would improve with remodeling over years. However, in an adult, and because this is a subcutaneous bone, this would be a big bulge just above the ankle. There is another example of malunion where somebody tried to fix the bone internally. However, the screws gave way or the patient sustained another trauma before the bones had healed, and this led to, although there's good callus formation, however the screws have come out and the bone is deformed. So this is another example of a malunion. Here you see non-union. You have waited adequate period of time. However, now you see no callus formation, no evidence of um, these bone ends trying to grow and meet each other. And generally, you will see that intramedullary. You see this internal medulla, and this is the cortex. Here you see that the medulla has been closed off. And now there is no blood reaching the bone ends, and there is no more union. In such a case, you have to tip off all this uh, bone blocking the medulla and put cancellous bone grafts in here and put an overlying plate to keep these two portions immobilized. And one very common cause of non-union is early mobilization before the callus had a time to form. So if some patients they remove the cast POP immobilization cast too early and mobilize their bones, it will lead to non-union. Occasionally, the periosteum or surrounding soft tissues can be caught in between the two ends and prevent the two ends from touching each other. Unless two bone ends touch each other, the chances of healing are very much reduced. So, how does a fracture heal? Uh, the first thing that is important is a fracture hematoma. Whenever a bone is broken, the intramedullary and the cortical blood vessels, the lamellar blood vessels that are going through the bone, they are broken and blood oozes out. This blood is rich in fibroblasts, osteoblasts, and stem cells. Therefore, one message that I would like to carry forward in your future life when you become maxillofacial surgeons is that if at all there is a closed fracture and you do see that there is a fracture hematoma inside, even if you go in and operate on this site and apply reconstruction plates to fix and immobilize these fractures, try not to suck out or remove all of this fracture hematoma because then the chances of bone healing are reduced. This fracture hematoma is a collection of blood. It is then invaded by fibroblasts and osteoblasts from the surrounding tissues and the periosteum of the bone. And this forms a soft woven bone, which is excessive bone, more than required. So you see a soft tissue shadow around the bone X-rays around the fracture, and this soft woven bone is called a callus. Once this has formed, there is precipitation of calcium salts inside the callus, and this ultimately leads to formation of hard lamellae of the trabecular bone, and bone healing takes place. However, because of excess callus or minor displacement of the two ends from one from the other, there may be a minor deformity at that site. and over the next few years, remodeling takes place, excess bone is resolved, and the body tries to align the two ends together, as I showed you in the previous X-ray of malunion. Then there are factors which influence fracture healing. One is that there needs to be adequate blood supply of both the fractured ends of the bone. If there is lack of blood supply on one side and there is good blood supply on the other, still the bone healing will be affected and the patient may go into delayed union if not non-union. Then the second point is that the bone fragments have to be immobilized for a specified long enough period uh, until there has enough bone healing has taken place for you to allow mobilization. Fracture hematoma, osteoblasts and fibroblasts, callus formation, and then remodeling taking place. These are the four steps of bone healing. So, how do you treat fractures? Reduction and fixation followed by rehabilitation. Reduction of a fracture is reducing the deformity or the displacement of the bone segments or the bone fragments. Fixation is you can fix internally with the help of plates, screws, or nails, or you can fix externally with the help of tractions or POP, plaster of Paris cast. Then, once the healing has taken place, but you have been immobilized, you had immobilized, your fixation had immobilized the joints above and below the fracture site for a long time, the patient will need some rehabilitation, at least physiotherapy to mobilize the joints. Closed reduction is usually done under general anesthesia. Closed reduction is when you apply traction and manipulation from the outside to reduce the fracture, align the bones, and then apply a plaster cast outside. Open reduction is done by open surgery where you expose the bone ends and you fix them together using metal implants. Uh, Open reduction is generally indicated in failed closed reduction where you've tried closed reduction but it failed, in unstable fractures where the small bone pieces are such in shape or size that the external POP will not hold them stable and they will keep moving. Where there are intra-articular fractures because the articular surfaces are glass smooth and you don't want to leave even a small step in the articular surface, otherwise the patient will develop secondary osteoarthritis and osteoarthrosis because this step in the bone will keep damaging the joint from inside with every movement. The contraindication to open reduction, of course, is infection. If it is a compound fracture and dust and dirt from outside has gone in and the patient has presented to you late after 6 to 8 hours, then infection may have started already, and in such a case if you put in a metal implant, the bones will become infected and the bacteria will find a foreign body to grow in or grow around, and then you will be in trouble. Fixation of fractures can be conservative or as we this is called splintage or external fixation. POP casts or tractions, weights. You must have seen some patients with weight attached to their lower limb, pulling the bones and keeping them aligned. Such patients remain immobilized on the bed for long periods of time and are susceptible to pulmonary and complications, deep vein thrombosis, and bed sores. Then there is surgical fixation, which can be internal fixation, where you are putting in the metal implant on directly on the bone inside the limb or the body, and then there are external fixators, special devices which are remain outside the body, but their spikes in the bone hold the bone in place. Plaster casts, these are used in stable fractures in distal parts of the limbs. Skin traction, here you see a fracture of the femur, and a skin traction, skeletal traction has been applied and a weight has been hung, and this is pulling this femur and aligning the femur two ends of the bone together. In children, this traction can simply be applied with the help of a skin tape and a weight attached to that tape, and that would be skin traction. Here, this is an example of skeletal traction where a Steinman pin has been passed through the upper end of tibia, and a horseshoe has been attached, and weight is pulling the skeletal traction. Skeletal traction can take a lot more weight than skin traction because the skin will be avulsed if you apply too much weight. Then operative fixation, this is an example of interlocking nail. An interlocking nail is one where you ream the intramedullary cavity and then you put these uh, titanium screws to lock the bone in place, bone and the metal rod in place. These are interlocking intramedullary nails. Then you have seen plates and screws, and stainless steel wire can sometimes also be used. So here you see a segmental fracture of the tibia, and interlocking nail has been passed, aligning through the segmental fracture also, and now this is being held in place by these interlocking screws, and generally the surgeon attempts to not discard the fracture hematoma around this site so that these gaps would then be filled in by bone. Dynamic compression plates have specialized oval beveled holes in the bones, and when you tighten the screws, the two ends are compressed together. These are dynamic compression plates, and here you see them applied on a humerus. Here is an example of a T plate applied to the upper end of humerus. Then reconstruction plates. These are larger size reconstruction plates for the lower end of humerus. But in your maxillofacial surgery, even smaller reconstruction plates are used in head and neck surgery and maxillofacial surgery. Here you see a figure of 8 stainless steel wire anchored across K wires passed in the fracture of the olecranon of the elbow, and these steel wires are being used to compress the two ends together. External fixator is a device where thick metal screws or spikes are passed into the bone, and then there is a rigid fixation system on the outside. Once that is tightened up, the two bones inside are held in place, immobilized. So this is a very good answer to uh, compound fractures, especially infected fractures. This may be a temporary measure until the overlying wound has healed, and then you can go in and do an intramedullary nail or apply an external POP cast, or this can be retained and until the bone ends heal by themselves. So the last topic for today is the fractures of the maxillofacial system. These are classified by Lee Ford, and these are called Lee Ford fracture 1, 2, and 3. This is an example of Lee Fort 3, Lee Fort 2, and Lee Fort 1. These we will discuss. Uh, Lee Fort 1 fracture is where you see this horizontal fracture line going through the base of the nose and just above the teeth. This is a lateral view. Violent force over a more extensive area above the level of the teeth will result in Lee Fort 1 fracture. The horizontal fracture line seen above the apices of the maxillary teeth, detaching the tooth-bearing portion of the maxilla from the rest of the facial skeleton. The fractured fragment is freely mobile and displacement will depend on the direction of the force. Depending upon the displacement, a variety of occlusal disharmony can be seen in this type of Lee Fort 1 fracture. Here you see characteristic ecchymosis in the region of the greater palatine vessels on the palate. Leaf for two fractures, here you see passing below the frontosphenoid suture, in the medial wall of the orbit, and then going downwards towards the maxilla, sparing the zygoma. The fracture line runs below the frontonasal suture from the thin middle area of the nasal bones down on either side, crossing the frontal process of the maxillae, and passes anteriorly across the lacrimal bones anterior to the nasolacrimal canal. The nasolacrimal canal is generally spared in Lee Fort 2 fractures. From this point, the fracture line passes downward, forwards, and laterally, crossing the inferior orbital margin in the region of the zygomatico-maxillary suture and may or may not involve the infraorbital foramen. The fracture line then extends downward and forward and lateral to the transverse wall of the antrum, just medial to the zygomatico-maxillary suture line. Here you see this medial to the zygomatico-maxillary suture line, and involving the medial wall of the orbit and the nasal bones, but below the frontonasal suture. Lee Fort 3 fractures horizontally pass through the orbits and then go downwards. Here you can see involving the zygomatic bone. Another diagrammatic representation, and here you see this Lee Fort fracture, and this whole segment is now free from the cranium of the head of the patient. The fracture line begins at the frontozygomatic suture along the lateral aspect of the internal orbit, along the sphenozygomatic suture line to the inferior orbital fissure, extends medially across the floor of the orbit, up the medial wall of the orbit, towards the dorsum of the nose where it crosses and proceeds to the opposite side in the same manner. Various amounts of the pterygoid plates will usually remain attached to the posterior maxilla. So these fractures, the Lee Fort fractures and their definition and distribution, because ultimately these are treated and handled by the maxillofacial surgeons. As dental students, you should know what are these Lee Fort fractures, and because ultimately you will be dealing with these Lee Fort fractures, and many dentists would dental surgeons would be treating mandibular fractures. So you have to know the basics of bone healing and immobilization, and you must have seen jaw wiring also. That is another method of immobilizing the mandible. And then there are reconstruction plates which are used to immobilize the mandible. Uh, mm, uh, so there are not only fractures of maxilla, there are fractures of the mandible also, and ultimately maxillofacial surgeons are the ones who treat them. So some of you will definitely become maxillofacial surgeons, inshallah. So that is the purpose of teaching you uh, fractures. We just briefly dealt with the introduction to the nomenclature, so that you can describe what type of fracture it is, and then you know the different methods of treatment, immobilization, and then rehabilitation, and the various factors affecting the healing. I hope this was helpful. See you next time with your next online lecture. Thank you very much.